After catching my parents planting evidence to frame me for breaking into their house, I smiled as they demanded more money and said, "We can destroy your future with one phone call." I pulled out my recording device and watched their faces change as they realized I'd been documenting everything for months. You see, my immigrant parents had kept a leather ledger since I was 7, tracking what they claimed was my $73,492 debt for being born. Every grade below 100 added another $1,000 to what I supposedly owed, but worse than the imaginary debt was how they used my little sister Alice as leverage. When I got an 89 on a science test, 6-year-old Alice missed meals. When I fell asleep studying, they'd wake her at 3 a.m. to stand in corners. "Your selfishness makes your sister hungry," they'd say. "Your laziness steals her sleep." The ledger wasn't just about control, it was their business plan. By the time I got into Harvard Medical School, my debt had grown to $340,000. They made me sign a contract giving them 100% of my future income until paid, then 75% for life. Hidden in subsection 47B was the real trap. If I defaulted, all debts transferred to Alice immediately. She was only 14, but as my father coldly stated, "Old enough to work, old enough to pay if you run." What my parents didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment since Alice escaped to Switzerland on a secret scholarship she'd been planning since age 12. The day she left, their leverage disappeared, and I finally had them exactly where I wanted them. As a pediatric surgeon earning $847,000 annually at Boston Children's Hospital, I had resources they couldn't imagine. More importantly, I had something they'd never respected: strategic thinking. While they saw me as their obedient cash cow, I'd been building a comprehensive case against them for financial fraud, identity theft, and child abuse. The recording device in my hand contained over 40 hours of conversations where they detailed their schemes. Bank records showed 23 fraudulent accounts opened in my name. Security footage from multiple banks captured them, making deposits and withdrawals using forged documents. I had everything I needed to destroy them legally and financially. But first, I wanted them to understand exactly how outclassed they were. "Before you make any calls," I said, pulling out my phone to show them photos of their own financial records, "you should know I've been working with Blackstone Investigations for 6 months. They're the fraud investigation firm that handles cases for the IRS and FBI." My mother's face went white. Blackstone Investigations was the most respected financial crimes unit in Boston. They'd helped me trace every dollar my parents had stolen, every document they'd forged, every law they'd broken. The evidence was overwhelming. "We also need to discuss your immigration status," I continued, watching my father's hands shake. "Turns out, financial fraud is grounds for deportation proceedings. My attorney, Rebecca Stone from Stone & Associates, has already filed preliminary reports with ICE." This was a lie, but an effective one. Stone was my estate planning lawyer, and I'd never involved immigration authorities. However, my parents' terror confirmed what I'd long suspected. Their status wasn't as solid as they had claimed. "You wouldn't dare," my mother whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "I wouldn't need to," I replied calmly. The Massachusetts Attorney General's office tends to handle these cases quite aggressively, especially when children are involved. I showed them another folder. Inside were Alice's medical records from Switzerland, documenting years of abuse-related trauma, photos of bruises from when I'd failed tests, audio recordings Alice had secretly made of their threats. Everything they'd done to her was documented with clinical precision. "Alice has been very thorough," I explained. "Swiss doctors are quite detailed in their documentation. They've classified this as systematic child abuse with financial coercion. Under Massachusetts law, there's no statute of limitations for this type of case." My father tried to grab the papers, but I stepped back smoothly. At 6'2" and 30 years younger, I no longer cowered before them. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, adopting the tone I used when explaining complex procedures to families. "You have exactly 24 hours to liquidate every asset you can access and transfer the funds to an account Alice and I control. Consider it repayment for the money you've stolen over the years." "We don't have that kind of money," my mother protested. "Actually, you do." I pulled out bank statements Blackstone investigations had uncovered. Between the house, your retirement accounts, the money you've hidden in relatives' names overseas, and the proceeds from the fraudulent accounts, you're worth approximately $1 x million. Alice and I will take $800,000 as compensation for 2 decades of abuse. The number was carefully calculated, enough to hurt them significantly, but not so much that they'd have nothing left. A strategic decision designed to maximize their cooperation while minimizing their desperation. If you refuse, I continued, I'll release everything to the media. David Harrison, the investigative journalist at the Boston Globe, who specializes in immigrant family abuse cases, is very interested in your story. The headline writes itself, "Immigrant Parents Forge Son's Identity. Abuse Children for Profit." Your photos would be on the front page. My mother started crying, but these weren't the manipulative tears I'd seen before. These were tears of genuine fear from someone who'd finally realized they'd pushed too far. "We can't transfer that much money overnight," my father said, his voice barely a whisper. "Lucky for you, I've already solved that problem." I handed him a packet of documents my financial advisor had prepared. "James Mitchell at First National has agreed to expedite the transfers. All you need to do is sign these authorization forms. The money will be moved to an escrow account controlled by my lawyers until we finalize the terms." Mitchell was my private banker, accustomed to handling complex financial arrangements for high-net-worth clients. He'd structured the transfers to ensure everything was completely legal while giving me maximum control over the timeline. "What terms?" my mother asked. "Simple. You leave Boston permanently. No contact with Alice or me, ever. You don't speak to extended family about this arrangement. You don't try to reclaim any money. In exchange, I don't file criminal charges or release the documentation publicly." I sat down across from them, adopting the calm demeanor that made me effective in high-pressure surgical situations. "This isn't a negotiation. It's an ultimatum with a generous offer attached. 24 hours. My father picked up the authorization forms with shaking hands. "How do we know you won't file charges anyway?" "Because I'm not you," I replied. "When I make agreements, I honor them. Besides, having you in prison wouldn't serve my purposes. Having you gone and neutralized does." After they left, I called Alice in Zurich. Despite the time difference, she answered on the first ring. "It's done?" she asked. "Almost. They'll sign tomorrow. By Friday, you'll have $400,000 in your account, and they'll be relocating to Florida or Arizona, somewhere far from Massachusetts and definitely far from Switzerland." Alice was quiet for a long moment. "I never thought we'd actually win." "We won the day you got out," I told her. "This is just collecting what they owed us." The next morning, my parents appeared at my office with the signed documents. They looked like they'd aged 10 years overnight. My father's hands shook as he passed the papers across my desk. My mother couldn't make eye contact. "The money will transfer by close of business today," I confirmed after reviewing their signatures. "You have 1 week to finalize your relocation plans. I suggest you don't delay." "Where are we supposed to go?" my mother asked. "Anywhere that isn't Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, or any state with direct flights to Switzerland," I replied. "Might I suggest somewhere with a low cost of living? Your remaining $400,000 will need to last." After they left, I called Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, the hospital's chief administrator, to inform her that my family situation had been resolved and there would be no further disruptions to my work schedule. She'd been incredibly understanding during the months when my parents' harassment had occasionally affected my availability for emergency surgeries. The transfers completed exactly as planned. Alice and I each received $400,000, carefully documented as repayment for documented financial damages. Completely legal, completely justified, and completely satisfying. My parents relocated to Phoenix within the week. They sent no forwarding address, made no attempts at contact, and seemed to have learned their lesson about underestimating their children's capabilities. The leather ledger sits in my safe now, not as a reminder of debts owed, but as proof of debts collected. Alice and I used our settlement money to establish a foundation helping other children escape financial abuse. We named it the Hidden Spaces Foundation, after the loose brick where we'd left notes for each other during the worst years. 6 months later, I received a promotion to Chief of Pediatric Surgery. Alice finished her psychology degree summa cum laude and is now pursuing her doctorate in family trauma therapy. We video call weekly, sometimes talking for hours about everything except our parents. The extended family eventually learned the truth, though we never provided details. They understood enough to maintain the distance we'd requested. Some sent subtle apologies for years of misunderstanding our situation. Others simply respected our boundaries and moved forward. I still practice at Boston Children's Hospital, but now I also volunteer at a clinic serving immigrant families. I've become expert at recognizing the signs of financial coercion and family abuse that I'd once thought were normal. Several times I've been able to connect families with resources that Alice and I wish we'd known existed. My parents never attempted contact again. Occasionally I wonder if they learned anything from the experience, if they ever acknowledged their role in destroying our family. But these thoughts pass quickly. They chose their path and received consequences proportional to their actions. They're no longer my problem to solve. Alice visits Boston every Christmas now. We've developed new traditions based on joy rather than obligation. We exchange gifts without calculating their cost. We share meals without discussing grades or achievements. We simply exist as siblings who survived something terrible and chose to build something better. The foundation has helped over 300 families in its first 2 years. Each success feels like retroactive protection for the children we were. We couldn't save ourselves at 7 and 14, but we can save others now. I married a fellow surgeon last year, someone who understands complicated families and the strength required to leave them behind. We're planning children of our own, children who will never see a ledger, never have their worth calculated in dollars, never be told that love is transactional. The house where Alice and I grew up was sold to pay my parents' debts. New owners painted over the marks on the walls where my height had been measured alongside my accumulated debt. The basement hiding spot is probably gone, replaced by a proper foundation. Good. Some things deserve to disappear. Alice kept one thing from our childhood, a photo of us in the backyard, age 7 and newborn before the ledger existed. We're both smiling, innocent, free. She gave me a copy for my office. Patients' families sometimes ask about it, remarking on how happy we look. I tell them it's my sister and me, and we're very close. Which is true, just not in the way they imagine. The recording device that started everything sits in evidence storage at Blackstone Investigations, part of a case file we'll never need to access. But knowing it exists provides a certain peace, proof that we defended ourselves professionally, strategically, and completely legally. My parents are now 73 and 71, living in a retirement community outside Phoenix. They have each other, their remaining money, and the consequences of their choices. Alice and I have each other, our chosen families, and the freedom they tried to prevent. We know who won. Sometimes I receive LinkedIn requests from young doctors whose families pressure them for money or career choices. I always accept and offer whatever guidance I can. The advice is usually simple. Document everything, build your own support network, and remember that the family you choose matters more than the family you were born into. Alice published a paper last year on financial abuse in immigrant families. She never mentioned our parents specifically, but anyone familiar with the patterns would recognize the case study. The paper has been cited in 47 subsequent research projects and is helping train a new generation of psychologists to recognize these dynamics. The leather ledger remains the only physical reminder of our former life. Sometimes I consider donating it to a museum or research institution. It's historically significant in its own way. Documentation of systematic child abuse disguised as cultural tradition. But, for now, it stays in my safe, neutralized but preserved, like evidence of a crime that has been solved. Our story isn't unique, but our response was. We didn't just escape. We systematically dismantled the system that had trapped us. We didn't just survive, we transformed our trauma into protection for others. We didn't just win, we changed the rules of the game entirely. The Foundation's latest project focuses on teaching financial literacy to young people from controlling families. Alice developed the curriculum based on strategies we wish we'd known earlier. It's already operating in 12 cities, with plans for national expansion. My parents' final lesson, delivered unintentionally, was the most valuable. Underestimating your opponents is the surest path to defeat. They saw us as assets to be controlled, rather than individuals with our own agency and intelligence. They paid the price for that miscalculation. Alice and I won because we understood something our parents never did. Real power comes from competence, planning, and the patience to execute long-term strategies. They had authority over us as children, but as adults, we had every advantage that mattered. Today marks 3 years since our confrontation. Alice calls every anniversary, not to discuss the past, but to share plans for the future. This year, she's announcing her engagement to someone who swept her off her feet at a conference in Geneva. She's never been happier. I'm performing surgery this morning on a 7-year-old whose parents drive 4 hours to bring her to our hospital. They trust me with their most precious gift, and I never take that responsibility lightly. Some families understand what love actually means. The ledger stays locked away, but its lessons guide my work every day. Not the false lessons about debt and obligation, but the true lessons about documentation, evidence, and the importance of maintaining detailed records when dealing with people who can't be trusted. Our parents taught us to be strategic survivors despite themselves. Alice and I took those skills and became strategic thrivers instead. We kept the resilience and intelligence their pressure forced us to develop, but discarded the fear and obligation they tried to instill. The foundation receives regular donations from successful professionals who escaped similar situations. Each contribution represents another family that broke free from financial coercion and generational control. The network grows larger every year, proof that these patterns can be disrupted when children receive proper support. I still have the recording device, though I've never needed it again. It sits in my desk drawer, a reminder that sometimes the best defense is perfect documentation. The 40 hours of conversations remain our insurance policy against any future attempts at manipulation or retaliation. Alice and I succeeded because we transformed our individual survival into collective action. We didn't just escape, we built escape routes for others. We didn't just heal, we became healers. We didn't just survive our parents' system, we created a better system to replace it. The Leather Ledger's final entry, written in my handwriting the day after our confrontation, reads simply, "Debt paid in full, account closed permanently." Alice suggested I add that line. She was always better with words than numbers, but in this case, the math worked perfectly.